Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here for the Forum on the Hill. I know the weather has been nothing but unpredictable this entire season. So luckily it all melted. Whatever happened yesterday is the remnants of that is completely gone. But thank you for coming out today for our talk. We're very excited to have our speaker here today. Beth Kephart is a National Book Award finalist and is the award-winning author of 36 books, a paper artist, a teacher of memoir. She will be reflecting on the role that paper, dollies, sewing patterns, wills, library cards, and more shape and hold our lives. Beth writes and posts her art each week on her Substack, The Hush and the Howl. Please help me in welcoming Beth Kephart.
Well, this is a beautiful space here. I have driven by this church many, many times over many years. I was a figure skater, and I'm actually going to talk about that a little bit. And I used to skate down Lewis Higgins Skating Club, and then I went to the Philadelphia Humane Society. So I was here a lot when I was a kid. We are here to talk about paper, and also about Darth Hunter, who is the man.
No, you're fine. Giving you a little more. There you go.
Well, I've always been told my voice is not loud enough. My Life in Paper is an odd book. It's called Adventures in Ephemera, and it began when I was cleaning out my mother's, after she passed away, with my father. My brother found, and then kept it a secret from me, this book. And Jeff gave it to me, my brother, as a Christmas present one year. And it is called My Life with Paper, an autobiography by Darth Hunter. It is printed on paper that he hand-milled paper that he made at a mill that I'm going to talk about. And I became obsessed with this man. He was born in 1883 in Ohio, and my heart kept breaking for him as I read this autobiography. His ideal, his dream, was to make sure that all the paper that we use was somehow handmade. Couldn't stand the commercial paper milled stuff. And he went around the world, 1 million miles he traveled to see how paper was made in all different places all over the world. He felt like he was a failure. He felt that he hadn't really achieved what he wanted to achieve with his life. And when I was reading his autobiography, I was teaching at the University of Pennsylvania, and also feeling a bit like a failure. And I began to think about the parallels between Darth Hunter's life and my own. This book, odd as I said it is, I designed the cover, and I also I marble paper, so the marble paper inside is organized into sections, and at the beginning of each section, I write a letter to Darth Hunter. Sometimes I'm writing to him about ideas of home, sometimes about the idea of obsession, ideas of success and failure, and so they're broad, themed letters that somehow intersect his life and my own, and big themes about living. And then each of those sections introduces my reflection on different kinds of paper, whether that is a doily or a sewing pattern or a will or an obituary, whatever it is. Today what I'm going to do is read you a letter that's not in the book, a letter that only you are hearing, and it is a letter to Darth Hunter. It will give you a sense of who he was and what he achieved. And then I'm going to read one section from the book about sewing patterns. And I'm going to show you, actually, no one else has ever seen this except when I skated in Lewis Higgins, perhaps, a dress that my mother made out of a sewing pattern that I'm talking about here. So here, and then we'll have any questions. There's so much in this book. There's so much about making paper. You were talking about having just going through your father's. What do we do with all that? How do we know what to keep? And these are questions that I think about all the time. So first, let me read to you a letter called Dear Darth Hunter. And this is designed to give you a sense of who he was. So it's to him, the you is him. You are 28 years old and already containing multitudes. Born to a newspaper family in Steubenville, Ohio. Trained as a Roy Proctor designer in East Aurora, New York. Educated in graphic arts in Vienna. When you found yourself there in London, at the Science Museum, confronted by your future, right there in the display case it was, antique hand paper making molds, the tools of typecasting, the material that makes the material that carries stories, forwards, documents and love affairs, fantasies and formula, suggestions and equations, dreams, paper, handmade paper dard. All at once and fantastically it obsessed you, propelled you, marked you. It became you, or you became it, a paper adventurer and a paper historian, a collector of paper and paper-making tools, a writer and builder of paper books, the curator of a paper museum. He had 3 different locations for his museum. It is now permanently on the campus of Georgia Tech, the Robert C. Morris Paper Museum. And because you are obsessed with paper, I am obsessed with you. I have stood in the house where you lived. I have held the books you made. I have walked among your paper trove. I have sat with your grandson, who has gone into your vault and emerged with photographs of you as a young man, as a married man, as an exasperated man, as a man undone by what he had loved. Obsession. Is it what the Oxford Dictionary says, quote, an idea or thought that continually preoccupies or intrudes on a person's mind? Or is it more pernicious, quote, a persistent, disturbing preoccupation with an unreasonable idea or feeling? That's Miriam. Am I being unreasonable, Dard? Am I disturbing? What would you say, were you still alive, to the idea of me, chasing all that is elusive in you, reimagining you, writing you? Would you caution me against the folly? Would you remind me of the folly of your desperate quest to build a sustainable and sustaining handmade paper mill? For that was the thing, Dard. That was what you wanted most. To prove that paper could still be made in honorable ways, far from the noise and indignity of the commercial mills that crushed the inherent beauty of the stuff. You wanted to reverse the cold-hearted, air-polluting, forest-decimating, money-laundering commercial paper-making industry, Dard. You wanted every single piece of paper to mean more than what was inked on it, more than the accounting, the grocery list, the diary page. You wanted to usher in a paper renaissance, and how hard you tried, and how I have imagined you trying, and how I have suffered for you. 1 year after you encountered the old molds in the Science Museum in 1912, you embarked on the odyssey that I draw the conclusion, changed your relationship to hope. Your first attempt was a small operation. You engineered near Marlborough on Hudson in New York. Below the dam and the nearby creek, you constructed, in your words, a small, half-timbered paper mill resembling a Devonshire cottage, using old oak beams and handmade brick. You thatched the roof to that mill with straw grown on your own land. You powered that mill with a water wheel built by a local millwright who used both cypress and pine in the making. You fashioned the tools you'd need, a rag duster, a pressure press, a dipping vat, and you understood poetically just what you were about to do, which is to say, abide the natural laws of things and assist paper in its making, a story you tell in your autobiography. But it was cold in the winter in New York. Your family was young and growing. The fruit you picked and tried to sell to partly fund your grand experiment was delicious fruit, but Dard, it did not sell. Everything that had to be done to make the paper was yours to do. The cutting, dusting, and boiling of the rags, the forming of the sheets, the watermarking, the advertising of the paper itself. And if there were some occasional breakthroughs, some customers and proofs of concept, there was mostly worry, frustration, and ultimately the need to sell the entire place, to leave it all behind, and settle in Chillicothe, Ohio, not far from where you were born. What does it say about me, Dard, that I still see the stuff of a hero in this? Where would you look were you here right now? telling me your story. Because you didn't give up, Dard. You didn't stop thinking and planning, hoping and finagling. In 1928, in an abandoned flour mill along a trout brook called Salmon Fields Hill in Lime Creek, Connecticut, you tried again. You tried even more intensely. Little by little, under your careful eye and to your precise designs, the old flour mill was transformed, the old stones polished and reset, the English appliances put into place, the heating installed, the stations established for rag cutters, vatmen, coutures, and mold makers, your own office installed. And upstairs on the 3rd floor, you made room for the finished handmade paper to dry, to hang like sheets in a still breeze until last drops of moisture had evaporated. Handmade paper, commercially available, history alive in the present day. That was your ambition, Dard. But it would all prove again, in your own words, to be a dubious undertaking, this establishment of a commercial hand paper mill, the only one in the Western Hemisphere. There would be operational challenges, financial stresses, the Great Depression, unfair competitors, endless tribulations and discouragements, non-paying customers, litigation, bankruptcy. There would be entire runs of paper bearing ruinous spots. There would be supply, but not enough demand. There would be, I imagine it just as intensely, Dard, a heart sinking like a stone in your chest. Maybe you looked for a time upon your paper mill odyssey as a failure, pure and simple, the end of a dream. Maybe, Dard, there was shame. But to call that mill a failure would be to overlook those days during which artists and bookmakers would arrive to take a look, or to place an order of your inimitable paper. The American impressionist Childe Hassam, the Scottish etcher James McFay, the type designer Frederick Gowdy, the bookbinder Peter Frank. To call your mill a failure would be as well to ignore the fact that the stuff that mill made became the paper upon which many of your own books were proudly printed. The stuff your mill made was bound in the pages of your own autobiography, a book published not by you, but by Alfred Knopf himself. And then this is the book, as I mentioned, this is his paper that came out of his mill. It's beautiful paper. And then it's like these insets that describe how the paper was made. It's thick, beautiful paper. 4,000 copies of this book were made. My mother bought a copy for $100. The sales receipt is still in here. It's $100 from Bartleby's Bookshop on August 14th, 2000. And when my brother gave me this book, because I make paper, I make mushroom paper and all kinds of different paper, I make all kinds of paper art. Jeff is the sort of person who doesn't really think about Christmas until that moment, and he's like, I gotta give Beth something, here's a book, and he grabbed it from his shelf because it was already on his shelf. When he gave me that book, I, as I mentioned, just fell in love with this man and all the different ways that he made me think about myself. It's all in this book, My Life in Paper. His story is throughout, but it's also so personal what paper is. Let me talk a little bit about the categories of paper that I share in this book. I mentioned, for example, that I visited Dard Hunter's home. Dard Hunter's grandson, who was born just a few days after Dard Hunter died in 1966, he lives in the house that Dard Hunter lived in. And one of the things that Dard Hunter, the original Dard Hunter, he didn't just make the paper. He designed the typeface, he chiseled out the fonts, he printed himself, and he would go around the world, as I said, maybe to India, where he would meet Gandhi, who taught paper making to help create a middle class for Indians who could learn how to do that and sell their paper. So all of what Dard was doing has relevance today. I will tell you that after he died, I was going to tell you about the books. So he'd go around to India, for example, and then he'd come home, he'd write of his experiences, and then he'd make these books. They were like this big and this wide. Each piece of paper he'd print, the story he would, lay in each type. He would then put into the back of the book these little samples of paper he found in Vietnam, in China, in India, all Tahiti, all over the world. And then he would sell about 130 copies of these big books, which were beautifully bound by Peter Frank in that case. And then that would be just enough money to go back out around the world and take another trip. I mean, he had an extraordinary life. When I think about paper, I think about the ways it facilitates our lives. First of all, I'm going to read you the table of contents because it tells you what's in the book but how I think about it. Remembering. Paper helps us remember. Our baby books, our scrapbooks, photographs, menus. Have you ever found an old menu stuck in and you're like, you immediately remember the dinner? Your homework. I find these embarrassing first grade, third grade, University of Pennsylvania where I went to school, bits of homework, and diaries. So remembering. Craft. Paper bags. What do we carry in paper bags? Amateur art. Saturation. Oatmeal boxes. Remember making pinhole cameras with oatmeal boxes. Paper reminds us of home. Our mother's recipes, the games that we play, sewing patterns, maps, sheet music, deeds. Paper is an obsession. Blueprints, instructions, family trees, rare books. Paper is a possession. Like, have you ever kept tickets from a show you went to, a library card, a receipt, a doily, money? Paper reminds us of our ambitions. Again, homework, file folders, dictionaries, date books. It is how we've understood ballots, who we're voting for and why, luminaries, blank books, report cards, syllabus, spreadsheets are all for me about doubt. Making, I think a lot about the wasp papers and the broadsides and the pulp, and love, confidence, correspondence, all those letters we've written, how we've been erased or not, how we've yielded or not, and our afterlife. And so after each letter in those categories of remembering, craft, etc., there is a series of my own intersection with paper according to each of those elements. And what I'm going to read now is sewing pattern. And I play with pronouns in this book. I just read you a letter that is a direct address to Dart Hunter. Now I am writing about my mother in third person, so she's the she. And this is sewing pattern. And what I do after each very personal entry, and I'm going to share that with you too today, is I give you a history of that kind of paper. So you're going to get a little history of the sewing pattern after I read very personally about myself here. So the she again is my mother. She has to take the measure of her daughter, the first one. The one with the coarse dark hair and the face that comes directly from her husband, the girl's father. Except for the nose, the daughter has been spared the hook in the beak of her husband's nose. A son might have carried that nose, but please, not a daughter. Still, spared the nose, the daughter has her deficits. More than anything, her acrid awareness of her many deficits. This knowing curved into the slump of her shoulder blades, into the stiff-legged way that she walks right up to the edge of things, where she will stop. No faith at all in her own physicality or charm, in her ability to expand a room by others' happiness to see her, except when she's on the ice, when she is ice skating. First on a Boston pond, the daughter skated, then on a rink in Wilmington, Delaware, then a second, it's not here, now at the Philadelphia Humane Society in Ardmore, Pennsylvania, because the family has a new house now, a brand new neighborhood. There the daughter has acquired speed and a gritty, mystifying flair, a long leaping axle, double loops, double flips, and double lutzes, never the double wally though. She has the high-speed chase of the crossovers that accelerate toward the ecstatic flights across the ice, the dizzying spins, but never successful layback. the crescendo diagonal slice of an Ina Bauer, the repertoire of footwork which the daughter pretends to improvise, but it is always the same coalescence of mohawks, 3 turns, brackets, arms up and hands graceful as a dainty woman dropping a dainty napkin. The daughter is never actually dainty, only her hands are dainty, and only when she is on the ice skating. All this the mother sees in the afternoons when she leaves the bright new home where she's been working and arrives to retrieve her daughter from the rink. Her daughter's program music playing over the rink's loudspeakers. Her daughter's arch rival throwing her own double lutzes in her own chosen corners precisely when the daughter is toeing in and throwing hers. The mother stands in the numbing cold in her low-heeled shoes, her almost opaque nylons, her plaid wool skirt, and her heavy coat. She stands there watching at the metal barrier, not the fanciest of mothers, but as the prettiest one. Stands there as a woman who left her business at home, a woman who sews, a woman perpetually taking the measure of her stubbornly self-crucifying daughter. Back waistline, bust line, hip point, inseam, waistline, mood. At home, in the alley of her sewing room, the singer is ensconced along the far short wall, the pale yellow cabinets along the one long wall, and a deep-stilled window along the other long wall. The mother's latest pattern waits. A butterick this time. The 5940 young junior teen cheerleader majorette skating dress costume purchased after some deliberation for 85 cents at the local fabric and notion store. It's a, quote, fitted micro mini dress with 3 color variations and princess seaming. Has a flared skirt. It's without contrast godets. Barrel cuffed full-length sleeves, semi-fitted or semi-fitted full-length sleeves, etc., all according to the package. The slightly beige tissue paper pattern has 15 pieces. It is a kind of map, a topography defined by fold lines and easing lines, darts and dots, squares and triangles, adjustment lines, seam allowances, notches. Days earlier, standing beneath the flicker buzz of fluorescent lights in the narrow aisles of the store, among bolts of color, yards of thread, temptations of trim, zippers and rickrack, buttericks and McCalls, the mother had made her choices and then brought her purchases home, imagining the daughter out on the ice, wearing the costume she will make, with her own time, with her own surrender to a certain kind of love. She is a good seamstress's mother, boastfully artful, with skilled hands that slip the pattern from its package and lay it flat and, with silver scissors, snip. There will be globe-tipped pins in her teeth when she secures the fabric to the pattern, an iron hissing steam, the acid-free crinkle of the 85-cent pattern. There will be her history as a mother who has dressed both her daughters in clothes of her own making for almost as long as she has been a mother. If only there were a different first daughter, one who did not shrink from life and what life might be, but for there at the rink on the ice, where she imagines herself as a someday champion, transformed into the likes of Janet Lynn, who should, the daughter thinks, have won every single medal in every single competition that she entered. Janet Lynn, who was once seen skating to Beethoven's Lenore Overture No. 3 while wearing a sleek pink costume made by a professional tailor. That is what the daughter wants, what the daughter believes will finally transform her. A skating costume made not by a mother in a butterick, but by a professional tailor, by other hands and other eyes that take her measure. The daughter will not say the words out loud. Instead, she will sulk in silence. But the mother knows, and her own mood and measure will darken, as in the days to come, she will smooth and cut that pattern, pins between her teeth, the iron hissing. And now I'm just going to show you the dress and then read you the history of sewing pattern. So this is the dress that one of the dresses that my mother made me. It's not a Janet Lynn dress. I was taking it out. My husband didn't even know I had this. I was taking it out of the closet this morning. He said, "Why is there a dragon on that dress and why brown?" I don't know. Those were all my mother's choices, but that's the pattern that I was just speaking to. Now, but so sewing patterns, where'd they come from? Much of the story is Philadelphia-based. You can't even imagine how much history of paper is Philadelphia-centric. It's remarkable. And the sewing pattern is no exception. So maybe you'll learn something that you didn't know today in this learning session. Some called them gods. They called patterns gods. Hundreds of years ago, they were a worthy inheritance slipped from tailor father to tailor son. Don't show anyone else. This is our secret. But it was a woman who, with the enterprising support of her progressive husband, engineered the first mass production and widely distribution of sewing patterns, both in the United States and abroad. She'd made herself sound French, Madame de Marist, but Ellen Louise Curtis, 1824 to 1898, was in fact a native New Yorker, the daughter of a hat maker, a once flourishing milliner, operating her own high fashion establishment, and the second wife of a progressive widower, William Jennings de Marist. It was as a newly married woman, taking a slight sabbatical from work, that Ellen had a thought while watching her maid cut out a dress from brown wrapping paper pattern. I like the way Ishbel Ross tells the story in Crusades and Crinolines, and this is a quote from him. Why not patterns in thin paper that could be duplicated endlessly and distributed at small cost? Why not assemble the asserted segments for demonstration purposes? Mr. de Marist hastened the development of the idea. To him, it was largely a problem of mathematics. Why not indeed? So that soon enough, a small crowd had gathered outside the de Marist Philadelphia home on Franklin Square to bear witness to 24 paper patterns on display in the couple's front parlor. Again, Ross is our guide. Women in tartans with wasp waist, wide sleeves, and flying bow knots clustered around the narrow house and blocked the stairs and sidewalk. They were face to face with a provocative innovation at a time when the sewing machine was worrying its way to mass popularity. Soon the de Marists were in Manhattan, operating an emporium that retailed the patterns alongside additional de Marist curated must-haves. By 1860, Mr. de Marist was launching Mademoiselle de Marist Mirror Fashions, a quarterly magazine with a blue and gold cover that both advertised the patterns, they retailed from between 25 cents up to 50, sometimes $1, and included a free sample pattern in every issue. In short order, the de Marists were hiring designers, further adapting French fashions to American taste, and catering to women of more or less means, and placing additional advertisements in such publications as Frank Leslie's Ladies' Gazette of Fashion and Godey's Ladies' Book. They sold the patterns not just in their own emporium, but through clubs established across the United States, where African-American sales agents worked side by side with white agents, received the same wages, and went to the same parties. The de Marists would prove to be exceedingly important abolitionists, following the decline of their patent business. The de Marists didn't patent their patterns, but Ebenezer Butterick patented his, which gave him a distinct commercial advantage. Still, by 1876, the de Marists had sold more than 3 million paper patterns, had overseen an expansion to some 1,500 shops, and were exhibiting in the main hall of the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Exposition. You can see the Madame's expert touch in the silver centennial print that still persists today. You can find it online. The mannequins adorned in de Marist fashions, the wooden showcases abundant with shirts and skirts, the drawers stuffed with a plenty of de Marist patterns. Madame de Marist was an outspoken feminist. Her paper patterns were designed to liberate the woman by placing coveted trendy fashions within economical reach. But by the time my mother was standing in a fabric and notion store, thumbing through the available patterns and choosing the accompanying fabrics, home-sewn clothes were simply not as commanding in the eyes of at least one sullen American daughter as the stuff that could be bought off the racks or fabricated by professional tailors. And so, a little bit of me and a little bit of history. How much time is there left? I was going to read a piece of the back.
Still about 30 minutes.
How many minutes?
30.
Okay. I'm going to read I want to talk to all of you, so I'm not going to take all my time reading. But I was mentioning this to you, so I'm going to read it here. I had written this book, thought it was done. You go through it over and over. There's still mistakes. No matter what you do, 36 books in, there are still mistakes in books. And we can talk about that. But I was maybe into the third draft of working with Temple University Press, who published this, when I have bookshelves in my office, and they're overcrowded, and one collapsed. All of the books came all to the floor, and in the process, doesn't matter quite how, I found a box of letters that I had not read or looked at. I don't know if ever, actually. But they were from my parents. And so much of this book, as you could probably tell, is me trying to counter with who I was, who I assumed my parents were towards me. You know, all those regrets you have as you get older, you realize that they weren't really that way. I was just seeing them that way. And so this is at the very end of the book. It's called Envelope. And I'm going to read it to you because I think it's an experience we all have. And I think it's what really paper does to and for and with us in the end, which is that it forces us endlessly to go back over the history we thought we knew, the people we thought we knew, ourselves, and to reassess, to look again in the mirror of paper. So again, you will just have to trust me that throughout the book I'm thinking about my father, my mother, and other people, my Uncle Danny, etc. But here it is, called Envelope. The poets fall to their knees. This is the book's falling. The long shelf where they'd been perched, quivering, then slipping, until Williams, Kuser, Pastan, Wright, Millows, Kunitz, Gluck, Hirschfeld, Stern, Oliver, Rich, Forshey, those are all the poets, are sent slumping and plunging, knocking their heads on their way to the floor, scuffing the stuff of their spines. I run through the furs of morning sun to break the cascade, but the books fall, the poets sprawl. Bleached shells fall with them, photographs, the dust of a hummingbird's nest, a silver spoon, the signature of Roseanne Cash. Everything in an instant is declassified, and this is how we find the parts of us that we've lost. In the things that fall in the room we now must rearrange. Not just the shelves and the shells and the poets, but the antique spinning wheel and the green glass hippo and the stuff in the bruised plastic bins that must now be replaced. Slide the poets to one side, the shelves, the spoon, and sit. Snap the lids on the bins and lift, and a soft plume blows the aromatics of old paper. The letters, homework, cards, reports, the words in pencil and in paint, the 3-hole punched, the ribbon. Gentle now, for this paper breaks. Its glucose chains are strained. There is the short, fibered havoc of time's disarray. Now this is me, like as a first or something greater. Maybe second. Oh, oh, laughed Sally. See that animal with 2 tails. I like spring because it brings back all the birds and they will eat with us again. You could tell I was really a promising poet as a young person. In my city, the buildings will look like the things they produce. The Titanic was a disaster, etc. Little pieces of me. It is days before I find my father in the tired envelopes that have lain dormant for decades in one bin. I pull his letters through torn edges, and I am 22 again, alone in a house up north, while the family spends the summer in a Spanish moss beach town. I am carrying injustice forward, refusing to forgive my mother for loving me less, or so her words have made it seem, the way she looks at me or doesn't, the way she watches me not eat or eat, the way she practices her secrets, what is hers to keep. My battle plan is a lonesome independence, a clerical job among ancient, bright-toothed dentists in a murky university basement. Every friend I have lives somewhere else. The city is smog, and my father writes to me. He keeps me company with nonsense, and now this is my dad. It's now about 10 o'clock on what promises to be a hot, sunny Saturday. It will be a race between the 5-mile-per-hour bike riding, walking to the beach, or just sitting on the deck today. We must conserve our energy because we're going to the Playhouse tonight on the last evening of a smash hit production of My Fair Later, now again in a new letter, my father worries. Incidentally, if you don't want to have a completely prostrate mother on your hands, get your weight back up to by 10 to 15 pounds and quit walking on some of the back alleys of Philadelphia. As a suggestion, you could always get some shrimp or fish from the Seafood Connection in Bryn Mawr. They also have some very delicious vegetables and fruit. Try eating small bowls of cereal with a little milk. Eat potatoes, some fresh orange juice, bread. Eat out once in a while with friends, Betsy. It's very clear when living alone, very easy when living alone to cheat yourself out of eating. Please don't. Remember, the paragraph above was not following advice. It was a plea. And then, my father writes as if I'm there with him, learning laziness in another letter. It's a somewhat gray, dripping morning which seems to be having difficulty deciding what kind of day it wants to be. It is ideal for legitimizing the feelings of laziness which has dominated my body these last couple days. I must either succumb to it or enjoy it without thinking about what I could be doing, or just snap out of it, get with it. I'm over-exercising my writing muscles and must go lie down and rest. Have fun. We love you very much. And then my father waits. Please try to pin down one or two options on when you might break away and join us here. What I was to him, what he was to me, in the folds of the paper inside the torn envelopes, in the summer when I taught myself the habits of resistance and hardened myself to his entreaties, the way I relinquished the version of me that might have been me, so that later I could not go back to this father who loved so easily. He still believed that with the right found words, he would finally persuade me, come back, trust. It's not that old paper changes the past. It's that it dislocates long prejudice, shifts the landscape of our seeing. It returns the man at the edge of the sea who is watching the waves for dolphin sheen without us, riding his bike beneath the heavy moss without us, buying 2 donuts and eating them both because we're not there to share them, because staying away, because famishing ourselves has become our radical rebellion. Dear Beth Ellen, dear Beth, dear Betsy, dear daughter, dear friend, dear traveler, please. The cellulose cracks, the dust plumes. Memory is aromatic, and we cannot change who we didn't become, but we can rearrange our love, dispose the facts that were, retrieve from the bin the one last envelope, tall and wide and graying, marked with a man's engineering hand, Beth and Bill wedding. Records and General Information, June 28, 1985. We can see that all of what he planned is here, everything he paid for. My discount wedding dress and my preposterous hat, the stretch limousine from Ralph R. DeBruzio, the 4-tiered wedding cake, no rosettes, the flowers from Albright's, the 3rd string band, the food and champagne and open bar for the guest he listed on successive graph paper sheets, one after the other, these names of people he mostly did not know, including the family of the man the oldest daughter was to marry. He had to trust this daughter, the one who had not watched the sea with him when he asked so nicely. Lists of photographs, lists of gifts, lists, a page carrying this header. Where to change from wedding dress and tuxedo, what to wear, how to get to first night place, which was in the Chestnut Hill Hotel. The first night place, and now in a crumple, nearly overlooked, is a folded index card. And on the card are the words my father wrote to bless his daughter's marriage. Words he must have written in practice and slipped into a pocket on that rainy wedding day, the hard seam of the folded card, the weight he carried. The words becoming words he gave, and then thought to save, so that his daughter might find them when she'd come to miss him most, all these decades on. He wrote, Dear God, we are blessed by your gifts of love, family, and friends, and may we never lose sight of how precious, how fragile these gifts are. Help Beth and Bill weather the storms of life. The daughter cannot break the tilt, the fall in her furs of sun. She cannot stop the sprawl. She is the one now on her knees, and now she stands. She leaves the house, her vision blurred. She buys her father bundled sunflowers. She drives, she parks. She drapes the flowers one by one across the arc of his granite stone. She studies his name in the marker, and his mother's name beside her mother's name beside his. And she will, she knows, rescue her mother's words soon. She will retrieve them from the ragged envelopes. The deer will visit her parents when she's gone. The birds will call. And then this tiny footnote here is envelope from the new, shorter Oxford. 1. A wrapper, a covering, an enveloping layer of structure. 2. The covering of a letter, now a piece of paper folded to form a packet, usually with a flap that can be sealed for completely enclosing a document. And then I say, subtract the final E, envelope, and it is everything, surrounding and touching on all sides. So that is from this book. And I want to tell a short story about how you just keep finding paper. So in the same way that my brother gave me the Dart Hunter book that brought my mother and father and all this thinking to me, this whole adventure going to Chillicothe, Ohio, and finding and sitting in Dart Hunter's house and on the couch where he actually died and seeing his crest and all of those things, going down to Georgia Tech, going to the museum of hundreds of thousands of things that Dart Hunter had collected over time. Jeff's book brought me that. My mother's book that Jeff decided to give me brought me that. There's someone in my life, my grandmother died she lived on Gallier Avenue in Southwest Philadelphia. She died when I was 9, and she was extraordinarily important to me, but as a 9-year-old, you don't really know your grandmother. My parents didn't talk about their families. I didn't get the chance to really know my family history. But my grandmother had a niece that I knew as Aunt Miriam. And about 25 years ago, my Aunt Miriam wrote a 1.5-page letter telling me and my brother and sister everything that was known about my grandmother. That's all that, a page and a half. And that was the full knowledge of my grandmother's life. But in that letter was my grandmother's favorite song, and it was the fact that she worked at the Fleischer yarn factory at 26th and Reed, an extraordinary building. After doing research, I learned about it, that the Fleischers created. Was there from like 1917 to 18, and it was over in 1930. But there at the Fleischer yarn factory, during especially World War I, were all these young women who were making the yarn. During the war, the men were sent out without hats, so yarn was being made, and the whole American Red Cross was telling you how to knit for these men, but in this gorgeous building, on the upper floors were locker rooms, medical places for if you had any accidents, dancing lessons, music lessons, art. The Fleischer art was there. And so I then wrote what is a novel, but there's a lot of personal kind of stuff in here. This that's coming out in 6 weeks. Tomorrow will be bring Sunday's News, which is 1918 Philadelphia. Me imagining my grandmother, she would have been 16. The little that is known about her, and then also 1969 Philadelphia. And so this box, 25 years, it sat in 2 or 3, we're not sure, different people back of their closet. And then finally, the daughter of somebody had found it, found my brother who works in New York, and drove it to him, and it came to us. And with it, I'll show you, my uncle, her son, my Uncle Danny, it's part of this story too. He was an antiques expert. These are from antique scrapbooks. He made and sold in places like Neiman Marcus and Bloomingdale's these ornaments. And when I was a little kid, I would help him with the easy parts, make them. And so inside this box with the letter from my Aunt Miriam were ornaments that my uncle had meant for us to have for 25, 30 years. And so again, without Dart Hunter's book, there would never be my life in paper. Without this stranger to us finding this box, figuring out who was supposed to get it 25, 30 years ago, and getting to it, there would be no no knowledge, most importantly, in me of anything about this grandmother that I love so much. So paper is everything. I hope I've conveyed that, but also for a writer and a paper artist, it's a heck of a lot. So if you have any questions, or really, I don't know what you'd have questions about, but if you have any stories about paper that you'd like to share with each other, you should do that. Tell me.
Well, one thing I will share, I think Channel 12, several years ago, did the history of paper back in the early centuries with the monks and how they, parchment and I think animal skin even, back in the day. And they brought it up, and as you talk about the different countries had their different techniques.
Yes.
India, Taiwan, Japan,
Yes.
all of it, paper is just beautiful. I mean, it made me appreciate
It is,
what
and
paper's like.
parchment is different because it's animal skin.
Yes.
But yes, what has held, it was a Chinese invention.
Yeah.
Early, it's all that story is in here. And it was a secret at first, and then passed on. But the thing is that paper can be made with so many different things, right? Paper can be made with so many different things. Corn silks. I make paper with mushrooms. You can make them with, all kinds of organic material. And what's really interesting about Dart Hunter, he died and he thought, oh goodness, I didn't really leave behind this legacy. Well, right after he died, these young people said, well, who is this Dart Hunter? They would find some of these books in libraries, and they would try to figure out how he was making paper and how some of these other cultures made paper. And this whole handmade paper renaissance began because of him, but he never got to see it. So now there are incredible handmade paper makers, all over the world, doing important stuff, making important art with it. He didn't get to see it, but he really was the grandfather of so much of what's happening right now in this paper renaissance. And there are those who are saying, for environmental reasons, why not? Why not take this, I'm going to make this up, field of wheat, actually it's in the book, some of this stuff, but why not take this and make paper with it, rather than what, so much of, there's been a lot of improvement in commercial mill pollution. A lot of recycling, a lot of how do we not just spoil the water while we're making paper. But there are still hopes for the planet that we could grow crops and make gorgeous, beautiful paper more consistently in a way that's more available to many. So yes, it's a beautiful story, paper. And of course, we aren't the only ones who make it. The paper wasp makes paper. If you go and you see like a lantern it looks like a lantern. It's so interesting how, and that story too is here. There is a story here, Dart Hunter would find all these history books about, various people and all the different ways that they made paper, and I do write about that in here. So there is the history of paper in here, folded into the personal and to Dart's story. Anybody have a story about paper or anything that they would like to share? Yeah.
When you were talking about the book, I guess your brother gave you in different writings. Just yesterday, my nephew lived with me for a while. His parents had both died, and he lived with me. And yesterday came across two little notes that his father had written to him.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, of course, I'm saving them for him. And I had come across little notes like that before.
It's remarkable. I'll tell you something that's similar, and it's amazing how you keep finding it. I write sometimes for a company called Core Knowledge, and they produce books that go into the schools. And so I've written about the life of Cleopatra, Dolores Huerta, and Marie Curie. And my mother, years ago, because she's been gone for quite a while, had given me a biography of Marie Curie that I had skimmed, but when I was given the job to write 10,000 words for 6th graders about Marie Curie, I'd take that book off the shelf, and it is this inscription from my mother, and to me, and it says, Betsy, which is what they called me, you won't have time, I am paraphrasing now, but essentially, you won't have time for this book now, but someday it will find you. And here I am writing Marie Curie's story. Yeah.
So, I have every piece of paper that I wrote on as a child. I have all the notes from high school. I have all of my cards. I have love letters from boyfriends from 6th grade. I have all of those things. And my husband is constantly asking me to please throw away these boxes of things because I won't part with them. And at first I was kind of like, I'm not really sure why I have them, why I still have them, but honestly listening to you, I'm like, no, this is why I have them. And I would like to, I've never touched them, right? They've been in the box, honestly, since I've been schlepping them around since high school, the way I went to college, I went to all the places I've lived since then. But I'm wondering, what could we say to somebody like my husband who's like, this is, why do you have these boxes of
when there's meaningful paper, and there's a lot of not meaningful paper, but when there's meaningful paper in a box, like you're describing, I think that's all meaningful. If you throw that away, you are throwing your history away. You are throwing not just your history away, but how you evolve in your own understanding of self. You could look at that box, you could sit there and look at it every day, right now, today, and you say, this is who I was, and this is how, 20 years from now, you look at this and you understand yourself differently. In the same way that I don't necessarily remember that my dad, it turned out my dad ran my whole wedding. Who knew? I thought my mother had something to do with it, right? But it was my dad. He did everything. And how I am so grateful that those shelves broke. Because they were just, this stuff was sitting in a box underneath them and I never looked, they're behind something, and I too had moved them. When my mother passed away, my father finally decided to move. I stopped work. It was a 10-month process to help my father pack up that house and sell it. And I was there every day, 8 to 10 hours a day. And there were times when my father would hunch his back and I wasn't allowed to see. And I think, because the fact that my brother had this book is just so odd to me, because I thought I had touched every single thing in that house. This was a book my father did not want me to know my mother had. And why? And this is just as mysterious to me as my grandmother, because what was my mother doing with this? How did she find a Baltimore bookstore? Who, in what universe? It's not like Google, she wasn't Googling. How did she even know Dart Hunter existed? With the exception of maybe 2,000 people in the United States, nobody knows about Dart Hunter, right? The people that go to his museum do, but they don't dwell on him. And so the great enduring mystery the whole time I was working on this book, and it's part of the book, is what was she doing with this book? What was my mother doing with this book? So I think that, especially right now, for some of us, it's really hard to maintain our sense of mystery, awe, and wonder and gratitude. And I feel that when I am confronted with some evidence of the past, that someone loved me, or that I was cared for in a way that I didn't maybe remember fully being cared for, it fills me in a way that is sustaining and strengthening. And I think that is another reason. We can't keep erasing ourselves. As I said, as you said, I have what's known as a Substack. It's called The Hush and the Howl. I started it 5 months ago. And I've been struggling with, so I teach, as you said, writing, but I also write these very compressed prose poems about interactions with the world. And I've been struggling with, well, how is that relevant? And what I realize more and more is that if we do not keep working in our art, in our history, in our conversations, in our memory, whatever sustains us, then we become flat. And we really have to be three-dimensional all the time. So, yeah.
Well, you mentioned the word touch. To touch paper is something really, really special to me. I'm just holding something that doesn't appear to be anything different than all of the other little booklets that people take notes in. I'm wondering if you can tell me where I could find handmade paper that has a texture that I can feel.
I wish I brought some of mine. I would have given it to you. I don't have
Are
it.
there any places?
Well,
that you
yes. Oh, on Etsy there are handmade paper makers. I make handmade journals with the art, anything from cyanotypes to marbling paper to these collage pieces I'm doing with pangy paper. So I'm really interested. So when my father died 4.5 years ago now, I didn't want to write anymore. The thing is that he cared a lot about having a funeral. He was a very modest, wonderful man. But when he was no longer able to go out into the world, I would go to his friends' funerals for him. And the first thing he would always say is, how many people were there at the funeral? And of course he died during COVID, and it was just what I could arrange on a hill with my brother, sister, and our families. And so at his whim, I began to teach myself how to make paper and paper things, because I decided I would make handmade booklets, like 150 of them, for my father's friends, so that they could write their memories. Then they would keep them themselves, they would have them. And that is when I began to learn about paper making. And there's some really, you're not going to find it, I don't think, in any gift shop. But you can, I do know that there's a lot on Etsy that do sell handmade paper. I wish I had thought of it. I make these tiny booklets that have the handmade paper covers that I sew into them, and they are nice. So paper has all different kinds of textures, I'll tell you. When I make mushroom paper, I don't like to use chemicals, so I use okra. I boil it down, it's a sticky pink mess, and I crush it, and then you just take the juice of it and pour it into everything else that you're doing. And then you have a paper, a mold and a decal, you're dipping that in, you're letting the water come out. Then you're putting it onto something called couch sheets, and then you're hanging those to dry, and then you're peeling them off of the couch sheets. And they're always going to be different, but when you use okra, it's smooth and you can write on it. Sometimes I make paper up. One of the books that I published, that was published of mine, the publisher had, there were 80 pages of it missing when it went out to bookstores. I didn't know this until my son. It's like, Mom, I love the book, but what happened to page 120 or whatever it was? At that point, we figured out that the printer had made a mistake. So I got 20 of these books that were a mess, and I pulped them, but just pulped them to a place where you can still see some of the words. You might see the word wife or daughter or self or something go through it. And so I've made, and then I add other, flowers and all kinds of different things to it. So every piece of paper has a different texture, how much you have actually pulped the paper and how much when you're dipping it in you bring up will determine how thick it is, whether it folds. So I would go on, on Etsy and look for the different papers. Some are being sold to artists who want to paint on handmade paper. Some is just, I want to hold and touch handmade paper. And there are, my husband, I sell my paper journals on Etsy and stuff, but my husband and I, he's a ceramicist, we go all around to art shows and sell. I've never seen anybody else selling paper. It's a kind of weird thing. So I don't sell just the sheets of paper, I always put it into a journal of some sort. But yeah, touch it, it's great.
I have two questions. Did your mother save that budget pattern? Is that why you knew its number?
Okay, great. It's so funny because my husband asked me the same thing. I told him I was going to do this and I showed him that dress. I knew that it was a butter pattern, and I went onto eBay and Etsy with that dress searching for the exact dress, and then I got the pattern, and that is how I know exactly what is written on it, how much it cost, the whole thing. Yeah.
And the other question is, my grandchildren don't have books.
Don't have
Books.
books. No. Yeah.
And they don't have written homework.
Yeah.
Are you at all concerned about that?
Yes, of course I am.
Our history?
Of course I am. I have taught children writing from, I think my youngest student was 5 or 6. And there's nothing like watching a kid wield a big tall pencil or a crayon or something over paper. It's a huge loss.
I I saw something, two things. Yesterday, we were reminiscing about my grandson's 5th birthday party at Benny Home. And he got off the refrigerator the picture he had drawn for school with everyone at the Benny Home having his birthday dinner, and the one sentence he had to write on the other side. That's how he spelled. So
Yeah,
there is some of that history that's still hanging on people's refrigerators.
but you know, your handwriting tells you a lot.
But the other thing is I just saw the other day is even high school kids don't really know how to hold a pencil.
Yes,
Oh, I see that all the time.
yeah. And architects don't know how to draw because it's all, you know, yeah, computer generated. My husband's an architect, so it was. So I'm seeing someone come over this way, so I'm going to step
Sorry.
away.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much
This is yours.
for being with us. Thank you very much. We really appreciate it. That was fascinating. Thank you all so much for joining.